Coming to you live, but not really. It is all pomp and no circumstance with Ryder Richards on LetUsThinkAboutIt.com, the amateur hour you should never tune into.
Welcome back. This is Ryder Richards with Let Us Think About It. Okay, we are at the end of a 4-part little series. I have been discussing repeatedly the lure of self-optimization, and I've been warning of various pitfalls. But, so you don't have to go back and listen to all those, we're going to do like a really brief, maybe 5-minute recap. So in part 1, I discuss how attractive optimizing the self becomes in a society that thrives on competition and precarity. So the need to prove yourself for survival means looking for an edge, staying on the edge. And self-optimization is kind of framed under the language of becoming your best self. While obviously, right, you have to change your authentic self into something different just so you can survive. So this, quote, best self, this is often talked about as your authentic self that is set free. Finally, you can reach your inner potential. It just requires you reshaping yourself to become what our culture feeds on, right? So this is kind of twisted. And in part 1, we ended up discussing Jürgen Habermas's notion of communicative rationality. One of the reasons we talk about it is it's kind of a stopgap on this kind of internal self-rationalization. So basically, make decisions by talking with other people. Make decisions with other people. Don't fall prey to self-optimization's echo chamber. Now, in part 2, we discussed the book Atomic Habits by James Clear. And this is really about how small behavior changes over time can produce tremendous results. And as Clear says, your habits are just the automated solutions that solve the problems your brain faces regularly. And of course, in that episode, I gave you some great kind of health and optimization tips also, and these are by Dr. Andrew Huberman, and I really like his podcast, so check that out if you get a chance. Also in that chapter, or in that episode, we discussed optimizing your environment for beneficial outcomes. Now, Clear says, winners often win because their environment makes winning easier. And in this episode, one key point is you need to know who you are, your identity, and really where you're going before you start optimizing anything. Okay, so let's get into part 3, which we just ended about 2 weeks ago. We drifted into this sort of cultural projection of the hero, and we discussed superheroes and trained assassins, as well as things like cartoons like Inspector Gadget, right? And what these things are doing is they're really priming us for kind of a blended technological future. But they're also discussing the overly efficient mechanization of things like RoboCop, right? This is kind of a Frankenstein's monster, and he's tragically neither human nor machine while being highly efficient. And of course, then we have the sort of more real and present dangers of genetic determinism they're showing back up again. This idea of eugenics that's kind of played out in Gattaca. And of course, toward the end of that episode, I launched into Friedrich Nietzsche and this kind of notion of the Übermensch, right? This is the template of the Superman, the Beyond Man, the Overman, which has been somehow co-opted and dumbed down by culture and society and comics into this kind of superficially buff and attractive warrior soldier, when really his notion was more about a journey of overcoming opposites, internal things, right? So this showcases yet another optimization trap that we fall into in a superficial or simulacrum society. We actually place the appearance of being a hero. This is kind of the buffness or the really optically compelling deed. This somehow becomes heroic, yet we cannot trivialize the internal motivations that lead to these things. So yeah, this is complicated, but we must not forget the internal and external journeys that somebody goes through. These work together. So these external conditions, these set the challenges that we face internally. And these external pressures, they can push on you, right? They can create the diamond. But of course, diamonds are fragile. And sometimes we're just appearing to overcome. We're just actually signaling overcoming. We're performing overcoming. And really what this is just bedazzling ourselves as overcomers without conquering those sort of internal struggles along the way. Now we're here. We're in part 4, and we're going to try to wrap this series up. And we're going to touch on things like careers and career paths to build capital for survival, the problems with willpower in all this, and how self-discipline and self-optimization kind of get wrapped up in self-determinism. And self-determinism can kind of parade as a type of morality, a type of subjective agency that really turns you into an objective tool. Part 1. Bildung. Okay, so I recently read these 2 books, and they're about career advice. And one of these was Range by David Epstein. The other was So Good They Can't Ignore You by Newport. So Range discusses that specialization needs to come out later in life, right? You should be collecting experiences when you're young. Dig in, learn some things, then pop up, go look around, hop fields towards some sort of compelling interest, and then dig deep again. And with this kind of lateral thinking, you can make novel connections between fields. You can basically become a rock star or look like a rock star, right? But the whole thing is don't specialize too much because that gets you kind of trapped and locked into static ways of thinking. Now, in So Good They Can't Ignore You by Newport, he discusses that you should not really follow your passion. In studies, passion does not lead to success. Being skilled like a craftsman and getting to the frontier of your field while kind of watching out for career traps, well, that will allow you eventual freedom just by being so good at something. So both books really are answers to how to develop career capital, even though they kind of diverge a bit on exactly how you should get there. But in both books, you must either focus now or focus later if you want success, which of course, that success will grant you more freedom and happiness to follow your own pursuits. The classic way to get there was Bildung. Now, this is kind of a German phrase or concept about 100 years old or something, but it was this idea of building yourself for life. The idea was that you could basically stay focused, work hard, and accumulate experience, and the world would reward you for this. But according to guys like Richard Sennett and Robert Jackall, this type of lifelong loyal dedication or being a good, stable person with in-depth skills, yeah, this no longer works in corporate capitalism. So I did podcasts on this at steps 32 and 34 and steps 26 and 27. So if you want more, dig into those. Sennett really says now it's all about potential. You must appear to have potential. And that really means you have the flexibility to do anything or become anything. And this means you're really not specialized, but to all appearances, one of these days you might be. So, right, this is crazy because our schools now train us on this. This is not actual specialization, such as having productive skills, but it's more like how to pass tests and appear promising. Now, this creates a permanent state of deferral where your skill is actually having the appearance of being capable of skills. And you pitch yourself as this kind of Swiss Army knife, but of course, when you actually have to produce anything, you just jump jobs, right? Because you don't know how. And you end up exiting instead of overcoming. Or you end up sort of playing deceitful politics instead of producing something. Now, Newport, he kind of thinks that you definitely need to specialize and get some skills. Otherwise, you're going to be subject to the political whims of these kind of potential posers, right? So to earn skills is your only leverage and protection. And unlike Bildung, right, where you could earn these skills over a lifetime, we're in a society where you better get them quick if you want to survive. And this is the culture of the new capitalism. So how are we going to do that? Well, the way YouTube tells me to do it is, set some goals, set up a system, modify your environment, crank up the personal productivity hacks, pop some Adderall or Ritalin, and twist that dedication dial up to 11. Oh yeah, slam that willpower whammy bar, baby. Part 2. Willpower and marshmallows. When a person can't find a deep sense of meaning, they distract themselves with pleasure. That's Viktor Frankl. And of course, that quote seems true, right? But let's also look at the reverse benefits of distraction and also the kind of problems with finding deep purpose or deep meaning. And of course, you need to do this before you optimize yourself. So how are we going to get there? So first, in Range and So Good They Can't Ignore You, the books I just read, as well as almost every other advice book, right? Even Atomic Habits. Everyone says you need to identify your mission or your passion. You need to find your meaning. You need to figure out who you are, right? And that's when you're going to put all these amazing self-optimization and productivity systems to work. Know your path first. Now, the unfortunate chicken and egg paradox here is often that until you have been active in the world long enough or have developed some set of deep skills and you've had lots and lots of interactions, how in the world are you going to have a clue what your passion or mission may actually be? Everyone just sort of tells you to have one. So Range brings up the story of a young man who wanted to be a Buddhist monk for a whole host of reasons, right? Until he actually tried it. And once he was into it, he realized that he would be quite miserable in this life. So sometimes, until you try something, you can't know something. So while you're on this path to find meaning, but of course before you have found this deep sense of meaning, how are you going to avoid distracting yourself with pleasure long enough to really find your mission or build your skills? Well, the classic answer to this is willpower, right? Yeah, that phrase. Anyway, let me tell you a little thing or two about willpower here. Okay, so in the book Breakdown of Will, the notion is that willpower is limited in supply. Really, at the heart of it, willpower is ridiculous, and the self is an illusion. Now, based on research by Dr. Daniel Kahneman in the book Noise, the self really is an illusion. It's actually a cloud of possibilities that cannot be accurately predicted. What he points out is that people can contradict themselves hourly if they don't recognize the situation. And it's even worse if you let more time lapse. So don't get me wrong here. People will try to give the same answer if they recognize the question, because we're all attempting a consistency of self. A logical, non-contradictory self is how we really like to see ourselves. But it just doesn't exist through all the data and the studies that are done. So your mood, the weather, what you saw on the way to work, all of these change you and your responses by the minute. And of course, on the Hidden Brain podcast, they talk about people in psychological studies who will proclaim things like, well, if this person treated me that way, I would do X, Y, and Z, or I would tell them this, that, and the other. And then immediately afterwards, they're put into that situation and they end up doing almost exactly the opposite of what they just said. So the self really is a set of possibilities. It's not a fixed thing that you can determine, because really you're a multiplicity of selves with a multitude of desires, and these are enacted by a market of choices in your head. So we must ask, whose willpower are we using at any given moment? If you cannot know who you will be moment to moment, context to context, I mean, really, what the hell chance do you have of landing on the version of yourself with super strong willpower to accomplish your goals or find your identity or purpose? George Ainslie, as discussed in our earlier podcast, which is like Step 19, Breakdown of Will, he discusses how our psychological mechanisms of willpower are very similar to how we perceive the actual physical world. Because what happens is anything that is closer to us becomes more important and it looms larger in our view. So just like perspective, right? So if you're walking towards a mountain, but there's an ice cream shop over there on the left, and the closer we get to it, well, then all of a sudden the comparative scale, the ice cream shop gets bigger and bigger as we approach. While the mountain in the distance, that's your long-term goal, it stays tiny. So this is the way temptation works. The closer you get, your desire gets bigger and hungrier, and it draws your focus more and more. Your long-term goals are blocked by the hulking form of the ice cream shop. And of course, you become blind to your distant goal, right? Because you can't see it anymore. There's an ice cream shop in the way. And what happens here is we must scratch our itch rather than delay gratification. Now, with all those notes in the background that basically kind of trash our concept of willpower and the fixed self, let's consider the infamous marshmallow experiment, right? This is where these researchers kind of taunted kids with marshmallows. And the idea was if they can resist eating those marshmallows, well, then all these researchers and other people would predict that they would be more successful later in life. Delayed gratification. Yeah, those 5-year-olds must have had a deep sense of meaning to avoid all that pleasure that was sitting in front of them. Right? But what's really happening here isn't delayed gratification or having a deep sense of meaning. Those kids aren't staring at the marshmallows and resisting temptation. Upon closer looking, and given what we know of willpower being depleted when you use it, because really you only have so much willpower a day, it's actually kind of more like the battery on your phone that gets used up faster the more and the harder you use it. Well, instead, the children who were successful at the marshmallow test actually had a coping strategy. And this was the ability to reorient focus. So we're talking about distraction. They simply distracted themselves with another game. So the lesson here is maybe you cannot turn off your desires, but you can redirect it. You can redirect your focus. And so here we are, basically in desperate need of willpower to focus and be productive, to gain skills so we can survive in this crazy world. And of course, we have to find our deeper meaning. And yet, I'm here telling you, relying on your, quote, self, that fickle cloud of possibilities, and, quote, willpower, that always depleted battery, yeah, that's a recipe for failure. What we really need is some sort of system that takes advantage of our natural, distracted, curious selves. Because, as mentioned earlier, research can't even predict what we're going to do in a certain circumstance, so there may not be a fixed self, much less a hard and fast version of you with infinite willpower that you can rely on, because you're always going to be fluctuating, and thus, we must set up an environment and a system, and these are guardrails, if you will, that will guide the self away from temptation and into a pleasurable yet productive path.
Just the tips.
Sonke Ahrens, in his book How to Take Smart Notes, he discusses proven techniques to quit relying so much on willpower while still being very, very productive. Okay, so part of being productive without pushing yourself is part one, being clear about your goal. And these are short-term, not so much life purpose goals. And two, setting up a framework or external scaffolding that can make success natural. It might even make it fun, and you have to do this in manageable stages. For instance, to be successful in academia,
Nothing you do matters unless it is published.
right? So this is the publish or perish. So really, that means you only have one job. I know you're supposed to be teaching, but really it's not, it's publishing. So why are you making it so hard on yourself if you know you only have one job? Niklas Luhmann, the highly prolific sociologist, he's developed a way to couple your natural curiosity, this is your desire to find desirable things to do, with a framework that leads to easily generated and publishable results. This is called Zettelkasten. Here's the deal. What if you're an artist who needs to publish a paper and you're interested in, say, high modernism? Well, the problem is that kind of curious self that's consuming all that information, well, that's not the creative version of yourself that you need later to structure an outline and draw from all these multiple sources. And that outline self, that's not the same self that you need to be an editor once you finally got everything put together. So you go from a curious consumer to a content scraper to a structure creator to some sort of editor. These are all multiple selves. But what if we could jot down just a few key notes in a way that would instantaneously create an outlined publication without us really trying or having to switch between selves? Well, then we wouldn't need to fuel each of those different selves, each of those roles, with whatever dwindling supply of willpower we might have. Even better, what if your natural curiosity made working actually feel like discovery, not drudgery? With each idea prompting more and more until the publications just sort of flow out of you. That would be great, right? Niklas Luhmann says,
I never force myself to do anything I don't feel like. Whenever I'm stuck, I do something else. Part 3. Stoics versus Epicureans.
The Stoic versus the Epicurean. These are both philosophies, right? But really what this might come down to is willpower versus marshmallows. So Zettelkasten, what we just talked about, this note-taking method to get published, that's really kind of a structured marshmallow hunt that you set up for yourself. Now, the Stoic, from what I understand, the idea is to be kind of thinking about what you can control in the world and being able to change your perspective on things. And through sort of an effort of sympathy and will, you need to be able to recognize alternate scenarios of the world through various mental imaginings. So, I'm driving along and somebody cuts me off in traffic. So I have to think to myself, can I control that situation? If I can't control it, I need to not care about it, right? Because, so what if they're a jerk? I can't do anything about it, so I need to not care. But also, I could do this thing of not even thinking of them as a jerk, and I could say something like, well, what if they're in a hurry to get their kid to the hospital and really considering them a jerk makes me a jerk, right? And so you can kind of play these games off of your sympathies to sort of become a better person. They also sort of do this imagining or visualization that's called memento mori, which is basically what happens if I'm dying tomorrow? how should I live today? What is important today? So this is another way to sort of play off of your sympathies of who you want to become to shape how you act in the current moment. So really, it's a great system, but yeah, geez, it uses a lot of willpower and mental sort of scaffolding to maintain itself. And of course, it's based on your sympathy. You're playing your actions against your imagined better self. You're basically manipulating your emotions with mental judo. And once again, the self is very unreliable in terms of consistency. So the other option here, because there's another alternative to Stoicism, and it's the much less talked about Epicureanism. So the Epicurean, it kind of does what the kids in the marshmallow experiment would do. They just reorient desire into another direction. Now, this isn't really toughing it out or manipulating your own sympathies really with guilt or something, as much as kind of finding external desires around us and reorienting our focus. Now, as William James says,
to wrestle with a bad feeling only pins our attention on it and keeps it fastened in the mind, whereas if we act from some better feeling, the old bad feeling soon folds its tent and silently slips away.
Now, this kind of Epicurean reorientation of desire, this plays into your animal instincts, right? It kind of allows the self to be whatever the self is or desires, and this draws your internal attention, this kind of willpower thing, back out into the external world, which sounds not at all like self-optimization, right? This sounds a whole lot more like self-love and engaging with the world. And of course, more importantly, both philosophies provide a way to react to life, but Epicureanism doesn't have an ideal self that it's appealing to, and it doesn't require buckets of willpower. There really might not be any plan in advance here. Also, have you noticed this kind of rise of Stoicism along with the rise of optimization? So this idea of control is really primary to both, but really, once again, what cloud of possible selves are you controlling, and with whose willpower are you controlling them?
Part 4. Subject, object, over-indexing, and ambiguity.
So a bit of philosophy first, and we're just going to lay some groundwork here, and then we're going to return with the conclusion about self-optimization. Now, a long time ago, from Plato to Kant to Descartes, philosophers have been moralizing about people who cannot think for themselves. Kant says the Enlightenment is
man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity, a lack of resolution and courage to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another.
And then he basically goes on to call people lazy and cowardly for not holding their own counsel. And this is basically like you're lazy and cowardly for not preaching to yourself with lots of conviction about your own thoughts. So by combining sort of demeaning terms with how to be, voila, right? We all of a sudden have a morality. This morality is the ideal of an individual thinking subject whose goodness was in direct proportion to his or her isolated interior thought processes. A bit later, Kierkegaard and then Jean-Paul Sartre, they get into this kind of notion of subjective truth. And this is really the lived experience from the individual's perspective. And this, for them, is maybe more important than the objective truth. And this is the exterior world that we all share. So that's a gross simplification, of course, because they wrote what they wrote for certain reasons. But we, the people, we really like this idea of subjective truth, right? Because it implies that the voices in our head were right all along. Hooray, we're right. Yeah, and everyone else is right too. But, whatever. At least now, trapped in our subjective heads, we're subjectively free, and they can't steal our rightness. Now, this is kind of crazy, and to combat this kind of idea of the sort of subjective truth, this tidal wave washing over the world, Simone De Beauvoir, in her text Pyrrhus and Cineas and Ethics of Ambiguity, and by the way, she happened to be Sartre's partner and lover, she says the problem with modern society is that the subject and object get over-indexed. So over-indexing means it's measured as performing better than it really does. So to me, this is fascinating, because if we believe that our freedom of inner subjectivity is what keeps us free,
I can think whatever I want and you can't steal that.
Then how do we account for the relations of the world around us? Because, of course, what happens if you are a slave bound to a master who objectifies you? And, of course, what if you are the objectifier? Well, this object-subject distinction sets up binaries that end up sort of perpetuating ideologies such as, I don't know, Marxism, Christianity, male-female stereotypes, all of these things. And of course, we're always in this podcast talking about trying to move past binaries. So De Beauvoir says, to be free is to be radically contingent. That is, to be free is to be fundamentally dependent, not independent. Okay, that doesn't make sense, right? Because that's not how we understand freedom. But the idea is that my freedom is bound into this reality, its values, and the other people within it. So let's maybe consider an analogy. People sometimes refer to humans as computers with inputs and outputs, optimizing our software and upgrading our hardware. So yeah, I mean, we have some subjectivity, but we also tend to be running on platforms developed by coders in California, right? And they have a set range of options in which we are becoming or that we can use to become. And in this way, our subjectivity is still reliant on a shared external reality. It's based on systems set up before you, because you're not simply free because you say you are, or because you overcome so hard. That doesn't make you free. So you might be asking yourself, right? What does all this have to do with self-optimization? And the real question for me is, what are you optimizing yourself into? Because the premise of most optimization is to become better, to become more, to achieve your goals. But also, why would you want to achieve? Well, curiosity? Maybe you just want to see how far you can go? Sure, why not, right? Perhaps it's for safety and security, and maybe some validation as well. But another option might be achievement, because with enough achievement, you can buy another kind of freedom, not just subjective internal freedom. So if we are optimizing ourselves to be free, it really is kind of problematic because you shape yourself to be more useful in a culture or system. You optimize your code, which implies stripping out junk code and streamlining, which really means reducing. As Douglas Rushkoff says, to play this kind of optimization game is to auto-tune yourself, to only land on perfect notes. There's nothing off key. You align yourself completely with a fixed point that was designated and designed by someone else. Rushkoff basically says that there's no soul in that. There's no room left for the singer striving to get to that next note and landing somewhere in the middle. There's no space to revel in the humanness of the soul. There's no space left for ambiguity in optimized code. De Beauvoir speaks of freedom as transcendence, and that is a movement towards an open future, a future without fixed possibilities. So freedom is openness and uncertainty, but remember, freedom is radically contingent. That is, it is reliant on others, but also it must transcend or overcome beyond the binaries of having to choose to be an active subject or a passive object that is just swept along. So, all of this to say, my grand sweeping conclusion, after 4 episodes in the self-optimization series, it might sound a bit abstract. It's maybe a bit vague and unactionable. It might be a bit overthought and under-edited, which is kind of actually the point. Optimizers love formulaic, actionable advice. They love measurable results. I mean, hell, I love measurable results and productivity too, which is exactly the trap. You can play the self-optimizing productivity game and you can feel great, you can see results, but at least know what you're getting into before you stick your head into the noose, or in this case, maybe into the server rack, who knows? So here we go again, long series short. Be aware of being too subject, which can lead to this kind of solipsistic ego. Be aware of being too much a superhero reliant on willpower, because that's gonna fail. Your freedom, in a very human sense, is not found in a mapped out future. Freedom is openness and risk. Your 10-year plan, that's not freedom, that's a plan, right? This is a path, and having a path can of course reduce anxiety, and it can get results, but beware of slavishly adhering to the path. Beware as your productivity turns you into a tool for the culture. You become too much machine, an object of utility. The more you try for freedom, the more enmeshed in that machine you can become. So basically, if I'm going to become a tool, which I kind of am, a really big tool, right? But I want to be some sort of meta tool, somehow staying attached to people and the world while overcoming and moving beyond the binaries of mind, body, subject, object. And that's not really optimizing. That's really complicating, right? So this is reveling in inefficiency and feeling your way around. And that's not optimal at all. All right, thank you very much for sticking with me on this 4-part episode. I know it might seem meandering at times, but hopefully you enjoy watching me feel my way through these topics and try to pick out some interesting aspects, sneak in some philosophy, and of course, linking back to all these various things that I'm reading or listening to. And of course, I have another project going on, which is daily navel-gazing insights. And this is at bellybuttonlit.blog. So if you want to check that out, maybe have these insights delivered to your inbox daily, give that a shot. As well, I have another show going, and this is kind of under the Helpful for Life banner, and it's called What the Hell is Water? And this is another kind of morning daily show that I'm doing with a buddy of mine. And of course, all the episodes are recorded and you can check them out. But yeah, give that a shot if you like too. Once again, the show name is What the Hell is Water? And that's under the company Helpful for Life. All right. Thanks again. And until next time, stay safe.